All right, I think this is a good time to start. 3 minutes past the hour, and if you're not on time by now, then you're never going to be on time. So let's start. I'm Dahlia Scheindlin. I've been privileged to interview our guest today about a new and very interesting book. And will give a little bit of an introduction about my background. I'm speaking to you from Israel, where I live. I moved here 25 years ago. I'm a political analyst most of the time, but I think about books. Over the last 5 years, I did a podcast called the Tel Aviv Review, for anybody who does or doesn't know it, which was a book review podcast, in addition to various other unimportant stuff like political analysis. But more importantly, I'm very, very happy to be hosting or to be interviewing and hosting Letty Cottin Pogrebin, who everybody should know, but just in case you forgot all of the things she's done over the years, I will read a few of them. She's the co-founder of Ms. Magazine. She's a nationally acclaimed writer, activist, public speaker. She's the author of 12 books. Like, why don't you do something with your life? File under that category. She's also published articles and essays in numerous print and online periodicals, New York Times, The Nation, Huffington Post. She's a co-founder of the National Women's Political Caucus, Ms. Foundation for Women. She has too many other credentials to name, but I will name one that's close to my heart. She was on the board of the Harvard Divinity School Women in Religion program, in addition to many other important public activities. And that's important to me because, as I just told Letty, I was a student at Harvard Divinity School long before I was a political analyst. So Letty, welcome, and thank you for inviting me to do this interview about your new book, which is called Shanda, a Memoir of Shame and Secrecy.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here with you. As I said in the warm-up that nobody heard, it's an honor, truly, because I so admired your intellect and your commitment to the truth. And we've been pulling the oxen in the same field when it comes to Israel-Palestine and working together a little bit on confederation as an option. So that's our kind of overlap, although there are many others, since I also know Dahlia's mother and father. It's circuitous roots to intimacy.
You've got the family covered. Thank you for the shout out to the work we've been trying to do on confederation, but I don't want to hijack the conversation, although it is interesting that you opened up with a commitment to truth, which is certainly on top of my mind these days. And if you want to write your next book about truth, I would support that. I also think that it's not unrelated to the topic of this book, and in maybe non-intuitive ways. I actually didn't have a question about truth, but since you raised it, I have a feeling it'll come up. So I suppose everybody knows what the word Shanda means, but in case there's one person out there who doesn't, it has to do with the shame. It is shame, but it's the Jewish shame. Letty, I want to start out by asking you, is this book a call to purge shame from our lives? I was going to say purge the scourge of shame, but I thought that would be too, catty.
I suppose you could say it is, although I counsel at the end of the book that I'd like to wish everyone a secret-free life, but not a shame-free life, because there's a positive purpose to certain kinds of shame, not the kind that erodes confidence and makes one feel as if one is inherently a bad person, but the kind that makes for conscience. I mean, that's really the gateway to a conscience, is that you have to be ashamed if you were to do such and such, and therefore you don't do such and such. I spend some time in the book, as you know, distinguishing between shame and guilt, because people very often associate guilt with Jews and shame with Catholics or other religions. And I think it's important to distinguish, at least in English. There's a kind of dead giveaway for the difference between them. We say, I am ashamed, but I feel guilty. So when you actually incorporate in your sense of self a sense of shame, that is deeply corrosive. And when you're guilty of something, you presumably could fix it. You could fix it with apology. You speaking about the 10 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, when we really do go and ask for forgiveness from our fellow human beings, because you can't get God's forgiveness for what you did to someone else, only what you did in terms of your relationship to the divine. So it seems to me that this is a perfect time to really consider what we're guilty about and what we're ashamed of, the difference between them, and what we have to do penance for and fix, and what we have to really interrogate in ourselves at a much deeper level to see who made you ashamed of what, if it runs deep.
Well, maybe I'll start with that, just to try to get in as many questions as I can, because in the introduction, you talk about why we write, which is not quite before you're not quite into the shame topic yet, but you did say that writing is a way of learning about yourself. And, since you mentioned looking deep inside and figuring out the kinds of things that make us feel guilty or be ashamed, what did you learn about yourself when between starting and finishing the book? Because obviously you had thought about these things already before you started to write the book, or you wouldn't have written it. But I imagine along the way, you learned things about yourself.
I had to, before I could even finish this book, I had to go back and decide whether I could unmask myself when it comes to one very, very big secret I was holding. And I don't want to speak about that on the air because it's in chapter 1 and I hope people will read it. But it was a secret that I felt would unseat my sense of myself as an intellectual. It was an illness. And I didn't want anybody to think of me having this illness because I thought it would affect how they considered my opinions and my commitments. So I'll just say that. But I was helped along, Dahlia, I started the book in 2017. In 2019, my granddaughter was assigned to write a biography of me in her biography class at Yale. And she said, Grandma, I'm only going to do this if you promise not to tamper with the truth, talk about the truth. Whatever I decide is going in, Grandma, and hands off. Will you promise? And I promised. And so she went to my archives up at Smith College and she read all my books, and she's a very dutiful scholar. And she read
Dutiful is one way of putting it. I thought she was very much an ambitious scholar.
Very ambitious. And at one point, she says, I want to look at what you have at your house. And she comes over to my Upper West Side apartment where I have a room full of wooden file cabinets. And she said, I've already gone through all of these. Where's the childhood stuff? And this was my breakthrough. I mean, I looked underneath at a very deep, deep cabinet where I had years before shoved a full shopping bag full of hundreds of letters, 80 and 85-year-old letters between my parents, my sister, other relatives of mine, my own letters from Brandeis University to my sister, who's 14 years older than myself, and the adult who took over for me, my life after my mother died. So I was very helped along in telling the truth by these letters. I didn't trust my memory on whatever I did know. And then I discovered all the things I didn't know about my family. And there are 52 short chapters in this book, each one a Shanda in my family. I mean, you do not want a family like this that marinates you in shame and secrecy. But that helped me reconstruct to create a memoir that had an actual through line.
So I was thinking about all of those family members, some of whom you encountered practically while you were doing the research, or at least you encountered their truer selves. And after learning what you learned about yourself, I was going to ask you what you may have learned about others. And I was reminded of the controversy over the author Lionel Shriver during the cultural appropriation, controversy in literature, and her argument, which was, so to speak, kind of shameless at that time, was that she was in favor of literary cultural appropriation because she said that's how we inhabit the characters. And so that was for fiction. I wondered if that happened for you in writing a memoir, that you were really able to take on the shame and the stories that you encountered, and what that meant for you. Did you feel like you were walking around with this family shame just by uncovering all of these things?
It was disturbing in so many ways, because as a feminist, I was aware of how many women had masked their true selves in order to be more acceptable, in order to not be annoying and enraged as they were feeling. So they covered up. They covered up their imperfections. Don't forget, this was an immigrant family. And they wanted to be real Americans. They wanted to pass for, the perfect women from Ladies' Home Journal. They stopped cooking cholent and they started cooking, mighty fine pudding pie. They wanted to convince themselves that their marital problems were normalized by Can This Marriage Be Saved, which was a monthly feature in the Ladies' Home Journal. They just wanted to normalize themselves. And in the act of normalizing themselves, they falsified themselves. They became someone else. It hurt me, especially with my mother. I discovered her deathbed note to my sister, who, as I said, it was 14 years older. So my sister inherited the shopping bag full of stuff. And my sister gave the shopping bag to me just before she died. And I found in it this incredible deathbed note in which my mother said, "I lied because I could not stand the truth." And that's true about her life. She was impoverished. They lived in 3 rooms, 9 people. She had to drop out of school in the 8th grade. She went so far as to set up a photo session to fake an actual high school graduation picture with a diploma. It broke my heart because she couldn't face the world as an 8th grade graduate. She got rid of her accent by listening to the radio incessantly and mimicking the English that she heard.
And what about her high school photo?
Yeah, this high school photo was the product of her own creativity in a photo session. She dressed herself up to look older. She was actually in the 8th grade. She was 13, and she made herself look like she was 17 so that she could be holding this fake diploma in her hand against her breast, and pass and put it up in her little tenement room, living room, if you could call it that, and hope that anybody who came by would think she was a high school graduate. She was so ashamed. She married my father, who was a sui generis for that era. He graduated from law school in 1923. It was not something typical of Jewish men in that period. But he lorded it over her. He made her feel like a greenhorn, and she was ashamed of who she was. And I want women to be free of that kind of shame.
That's interesting that we're taking it already to women, because I was going to pause and talk about the Jewish angle, but there are so many women angles as well. But maybe I'll stop for 1 second and just let the audience know something I forgot to say before, which is that we will talk between the two of us for maybe 40 minutes or so, give or take, and then people should feel free to write your questions in the chat box. Sorry, not in the chat box, in the Q&A box, and I will go through them and we'll have a discussion towards the end of the hour. So I think the women's angle on this will come up throughout, but let me start with the Jewish angle, because you do argue, it seems, that there is a distinctly Jewish problem with shame. And I thought about that. Is it really a Jewish problem with shame, or is it a specific Jewish manifestation of it? That made me think of the following association to challenge you, which is that shame begins in the Bible, and it begins in the Bible in the very beginning, in Genesis, right? With human beings created doing that thing, eating the fruit and being shameful.
Covering
up. But they're not
exactly.
exactly Jewish.
No, they're not.
So is it a human thing or a Jewish thing or a Jewish manifestation of a human thing?
I didn't realize how Jewish shame was until I looked at our wisdom literature, our holy scriptures, however you want to call it, and realized how many, for example, barren women there are in the Torah. Barren women who are ashamed of themselves, barren women who are ridiculed by women who are fertile. That shame was inflicted on women by a culture, even way back then, that was pronatalist, because Jews had to make more Jews. That's be fruitful and multiply. So the Jewishness of shame is absolutely rooted in stories like that. How about the story of Jacob and Esau, and Rebecca planning this entire, theft of the blessing from Esau by faking Jacob with a hairy arm, hairy skin. That's secrecy. That that manipulation, the lies, flat out lies that God actually participated in or masterminded, that I realized I grew up with them. And then I was thinking historically of how many hidden Jews there are, the conversos, the Moranos, whatever word is the least offensive, in Spain and Portugal, who had to hide who they were. The Jews in the Holocaust who had to hide who they were, who had fake names and passports. The fact that, as we have learned, thankfully, by reading People Love Dead Jews, that's how I learned it, that the Jews changed their names. It wasn't the work of the customs officer at Ellis Island. It was Jews changing their names to fit in. So they didn't have 43, consonants in a row, or unpronounceable in their names, which didn't work in English at all. And I think all those examples of hiding are we're steeped in them. It's like the fish doesn't know it's in water. We were all raised with this knowledge of hiding, that God begins by hiding God's face, Hester Panim, the hiding of God's face. It's woven through every bit of our sacred texts, and all of our Bible stories. All of our Bible stories have some bit of that.
It's just that once you think about the concept, as you pointed out, you start seeing it everywhere. So when I was reading your book, I thought about many associations, and I'll just give you two of them to just probe a little further the question about whether, how it is uniquely a Jewish thing, or what we can take away from that. One was, of course, Salman Rushdie's Shame, which is a wonderful novel for anybody who hasn't read it. And so I was rereading parts of it and remembering that it's about a Pakistani family who are so ashamed of their child, one of the main characters, because the child has a mental disability. And she herself feels such shame at her own existence that her body temperature rises when she blushes and burns people. That's the magical realism. But she also feels shame for the world. So that's one association coming from a completely different culture. And the other one has nothing to do with literature, kind of strange. But I was reminded in my first year of university, there was a party. Somebody had a bit too much to drink. She was a Korean Canadian student, and she started kind of pouring her heart out about how ashamed she was of her face and how she wanted to have surgery so she wouldn't look like a Korean Canadian. And so here's my question. If you're arguing convincingly that there is a uniquely Jewish form and understanding of shame, some of it has to do with being an immigrant community. What have we learned through all this suffering with our shame that maybe other cultures can use as well?
I have made a point in the book, as you know, of citing cross-cultural shame stories. And there was just one in the New York Times on Sunday about a poet, a Chinese American poet, whose family hid everything that happened to them during the Cultural Revolution. That's the way our survivors and children of survivors have dealt with, many of them have dealt with their Holocaust experiences, to blot them out. But I did want to, in service of my contention that there is a strong Jewish component, that's why I didn't call this book Shame and Secrecy or anything, because I mean, you don't, it's impossible to copyright a title, so I could have borrowed Salman Rushdie's title, but I titled it Shanda, even though it needed explanation. I tested out whether Shanda was understood by non-Jews, and it depends on where they live. If you live in New York, you've heard Shanda. And then I discovered that Shanda was used by Peggy Noonan, to describe the shame, in her opinion, of destroying the windows in the National Cathedral that honored two champions of slavery. She said, it's a Shanda. This is an Irish Catholic talking about the stained glass windows in a church, and she called it a Shanda, that they were being destroyed. So I think it's an all-purpose in many urban areas, at least. It's an all-purpose word that somebody stood up at the hearings of Brett Kavanaugh and said, this is a Shanda in the balcony, in the Senate balcony.
But there's one country that does not really use Shanda, which you notice.
Is Israel, exactly. And I want to get to that. But first, I just in one more piece of testimony to explain why this is so Jewish is if you talk to Orthodox Jews, a Shanda is something that prevents you from making a shidduch. A shidduch is a match. If you have a Shanda in your family, like mental illness or like the C word, cancer was the C word. For generations, cancer has been a whispered word because of the fear that your family has a gene or has a proclivity toward this illness. You can't make a Shanda, so you hide it. You hide it. And I've interviewed Orthodox Jews who say that the only people who know that they have cancer is their wife and their God. I've heard that many times over because I wrote a book called How to Be a Friend to a Friend Who's Sick.
Which is a wonderful book.
Thank you.
Right.
And this became up innumerable times. So that particular quote, Shanda quotient, is ruinous for a family. So we protect against that for reasons of, it's like you don't want to have a mamzer in your family. You protect against things that will harm your children's chances of success.
Right.
I'm sure that's true of other ethnic groups, but I know I'm writing about mine. As you know, Dahlia, I capitalized TJP, the Jewish people, because that's how I was raised. I was raised with this incredible admixture of Jewish exceptionalism and Jewish paranoia. So I lived through, as a child, I lived through the Holocaust here in the United States, but I lived through it as a conscious being because my family was obsessed with what was happening to all of our relatives over there. And I inherited that. I always say I thought Hitler was going to land not Kennedy Airport, because in those days it was Idlewild Airport, and take over the Jamaica Jewish Center where I went to school. At the same time, I was raised to think we were special. Right. We're smart, we have survival skills. We adapt, all the things that, we have Nobel Prize winners. You have to take responsibility for your Bernie Madoffs if you take responsibility for your Nobel Prize winners.
Right. But getting back into the corporeal, it's impossible to avoid the reality that so much of the shame stories in your book, and I think in every culture, come from the body, right? You have chapters and chapters of shame over sexual orientation, over sexual abuse, over wetting your pants, over, diseases, over so many things that I don't want to give too many spoilers. Do we have a mind-body problem or a body problem that we Jews or people still cannot cope with the natural aspects of our body? And it is, by the way, still striking to me that so many, many of the things that you talked about in the book as generating such deep and abiding shame are not so shameful now, or they may be a little bit, but people know they can talk about them.
Yeah, I without giving away too much, I can say that I think if you have a memory of wetting your pants because somebody made you wait and you were a little tiny girl and you had to wait and couldn't go to the bathroom, I don't think you have to be Jewish to be ashamed. To be ashamed that you wet yourself. So that I don't claim as having that Jewish component. Menstruation, again, focusing on women for a moment. Since I was an editor of Ms. Magazine and I read the letters to the editor that we got, I know perfectly well that women were writing to us about how do they get rid of the shame of a natural human function like menstruation. Without which
somebody in your book never got rid of the shame.
No. Mm-hmm.
She may have eventually, but not as far as in your experience of this person.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I think illness in Jewish families, and I can't attest to other families because I'm not privy to these deeply private experiences of serious illness, and whether they hide them. I wouldn't be surprised if they do. I know we do. I had a mentally challenged, mentally and physically challenged cousin, and all of us other cousins. I'm one of 24 cousins, and my parents were in each side one of 7. both my father and mother. So I had 14 aunts and uncles and their spouses and 24 cousins. We were not allowed to focus on what was, quote, wrong with her. It was never wrong with her. It was just, you have to include her. You have to include her, include her. They wanted to help her feel normalized, but they never told us kids how to help her feel that way. This is in the 1940s. Nobody knew about these issues, how you deal with these issues, how you help integrate somebody into a play group, to mainstream them. Who knew that?
Yeah. One of the other books that came back to me thinking about the corporeal part of it is Illness as a Metaphor, also by another distinguished woman Jew, who, as I read that book, tried to deconstruct the shame around diseases. Right. So in a way, these all sort of fit together. But I want to focus on something that I think was a very important insight that you return to a couple of times in the book, which is, again, this distinction between shame and guilt, and the story of a girl, we're not going to say which girl, who wets her pants. Okay. And the mother says, you shouldn't feel ashamed of something that you aren't responsible, that wasn't your fault. But what that made me think is how much of the shame that people experience are due to factors that were not their fault, especially the worst, sexual abuse, incest, the most horrible things. How do we cope with that contradiction? Nobody else seems to be able to internalize that advice, which should be clear to most people, even if their mothers didn't tell them.
Right. Yes. I have the distinction on the Upper West Side of never having been in therapy.
I'm not sure if we can continue this conversation, Letty.
I know. Well, I'm changing it now. I am now entering therapy.
But you have been in therapy. You wrote this book.
You're right. Exactly. My therapy is I just pour it into the keyboard and out on the screen comes answers. I will never forget an epiphanic moment when I was writing a book called Deborah Golda and Me. And I was trying to understand why. I was 36 years old before I ever went to Israel. And I was raised in a hyper-Zionist household. My father was out every night going to meetings during the Yishuv to make the state, and after the state to make the army and then to settle the land and all of that, our history we know. And why didn't I go? Why had I already gone to Rome and Paris? And I'd gone to Morocco. You can't imagine how many places I went, and I did not go to Israel. And I realized that through writing, and it was therapy, that Israel was my sibling rivalry. My father spent so much time going to meetings to help Israel, and he wasn't home to be with me. So I was punishing Israel. And those kinds of epiphanic moments, which happen to writers, and I have a line in the book that I think came from somebody else, Jews remember, Jews write. Was that Simon Schama? I don't remember. I don't remember.
It could be him, because
that's
the kind of thing, that's the kind of wisdom he would
right. Say. Jews remember, Jews write. And Shanda is a memoir of shame and secrecy. And I remembered and I wrote. And when I didn't remember, I had hundreds of letters that were revelatory, painful to read, but allowed me to forgive my parents for things they lied to me about. I discovered my parents were liars when I was 12. They had lied about things, rudimentary things about my identity and who I came from, who we were. And there's nothing that unseats your faith in human beings as to discover that your parents constructed an entire Potemkin village, around your history. They were so ashamed of the truth that they lied even to their daughter, and they enlisted the entire family on both sides. And I just told you how many of them there were to be party to this. It was a conspiracy to keep me in ignorance so that I could grow up without the shame that they grew up with.
I thought about that a lot. I thought that there are also things that maybe children are better off not knowing, because, I've experienced some families where everything is hanging out on the sleeve. And, maybe there's some downsides to that too. I think maybe children should be protected on some level for some time. The question is, how do you then reveal without causing, grave breach of trust and shaking a person's sense of self? I don't have the answer for it, but I guess
Right.
I couldn't help but think of the other side of that too.
Well, yes, I mean, we're the adults in the room. We have to figure out what would be too hurtful or too hard to bear at this point. Children are unable to process this particular complexity in their past. But I was 12 years old when I found out, and I fainted dead away. I was at a at a bar mitzvah in Winthrop, Massachusetts, and playing gin rummy. After the ceremony, we all came back to the house, and I was playing gin rummy with my much older cousin, 10 years older, and I was like 33 points ahead of her in one hand, and she just lost it. She just became enraged, and she threw the cards at me in my face and tipped the table over and yelled at me, "You think you're so smart? Your mother wasn't even in my family. Your sister wasn't even in my family until your father married your mother." And I felt the world shattering around me. How could this be? What is she really saying? What is going on here? And I literally, the blood went out of my head, and I ended up on the floor. And I woke up with my parents kneeling on either side of me, and they took me out on the beach of the Atlantic Ocean. And they said, "Come, Ketzela, little cat, little kitten, we'll explain everything to you." And they did, including that my father wrote a chart on the ground so I would understand the family tree. It was so confused. But that wasn't something horrible, 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 except if you were someone who was divorced in the 1920s, when it's the worst. It was the worst kind of Shanda. So my parents went to the trouble of constructing this Potemkin village to keep that information from me.
Right. Well, we only have a few minutes left, so I do want to get to what I think is one of the most important themes, which is a little bit left for the end in your book, but to give it more justice, I'm going to read it, which is, what do we do when people are shameless and don't have shame, or when a society loses its shame, as you sort of accuse Israel? And I don't entirely disagree with you, but it's a very nice passage, and I think I'm going to read it. It just says, "I don't wish to be shame-free or shameless. I want the specter of shame to influence human behavior for good, not ill. Good shame," and I think of good trouble here, is prophylactic, preventative, and preemptive. It stops us from hurting other people, stealing their stuff, or fouling the environment. Good shame can be, well, then you go on to examples. I think I'll stop with there. But I do think, well, here's the end. Good shame buttresses the rule of law and goes by the name of conscience. I would even go further than conscience. I think it's a supplementary social force that binds us to rules where the law can't really touch us. We have to depend on the sense of community commitment, which is glued together by shame. So where does shame actually help us, and where does it become a problem when we don't have it, which is what you identified in Israel, at least on some level?
Well, I'll be specific about what I'm ashamed of. I'm ashamed of the nation state law passed in 2018 that removed rights from the non-Jewish population of Israel, that created second-class citizenship for Palestinian Israelis, that suddenly delegitimated the Arabic language. And I couldn't believe it. I just couldn't believe that this could pass the Knesset, and it did. And I quote several members of the judiciary, I remember someone named
Legal scholars,
who used the word shame over and over again. So I felt, people are always trying to silence me because I don't live there, but I quoted them because it's like, I'm not the only one. People in Israel are ashamed of Israel for its government, not ashamed of Israel, the state, the people, the government that could do such a thing, in contradiction to the very beautiful and admirable Declaration of Independence, which is more explicit in 1948 about gender, for example, and others, freedom and legal protections for everyone in the state, and to counter that with this I think inhumane law was just a Shanda to me, which of course is a busha v'cherpa in Hebrew. So Shanda is not known to people who don't have Yiddish as their first language in Israel. I've been to Israel now about nearly 24, 25 times. And it's hard to find a Sabra who knows the meaning of Shanda, because it's considered a Yiddish, an old world mentality to use Shanda. So they have to use a double shame, busha, which is shame, the cherpa. I don't know how would you
disgrace,
say shame and
shame
shame.
and disgrace. No, disgrace. I would call it disgrace.
So they double up on it, which I think tells you that, for Israel to have reached the point where it needs to double up on shame because too many of its policies are shameful. It's a sad thing for me. I often say I had two ecstatic moments vis-a-vis Israel. One in 1948 when I was 8 years old, turned 9 in June, and May 14th I was still 8. And literally remember dancing in the streets, with flags and the Torahs and everything in Jamaica Jewish Center right out front. And the second ecstatic moment was when I thought peace was on the way, when I sat on the White House lawn on September 13th, 1993, and watched Arafat and Rabin shake hands. It was an unbelievable sight. And I thought, okay, I've lived to see it. And of course, it's all unraveled. So I grew up with Israel. I considered Israel my sibling rival, but I considered Israel my sibling also. And when you're ashamed of a family member, you have to speak up. It's like a family member to me. And as you know, I have a whole section of the book in which I do the dialogue exchange that I have, the colloquy that I have with people who want people like me to shut up. And I think we cannot accept shamelessness in our own people. Mm-hmm. We have to own it.
I'm all for owning it. I was going to stop and let people ask questions, but I see that in the Q&A box, we have no open questions, only a lot of comments of people saying hello, from among our friends. So I will take one more opportunity to encourage people who want to ask questions to do so, or forever lose your chance, because I have many more questions and I'm happy to keep going with my own selfish questions.
Well, so no, I have your questions.
Oh, okay, good. Well, let's see. I mean, this one is sort of, in a way, a follow-up to what you were just pointing out about Israel, but taking it a little away from Israel. Back to Salman Rushdie. Another point that I noticed that he made in the book is that shame. He has a nice list of his own forms of shame, and one of them, a couple of them are sexual and physical, but a couple of them are not. For example, and I quote, lies, loose living, disrespect for one's elders, failure to love one's national flag, incorrect voting at elections, overeating and extramarital sex, those are the two physical ones, autobiographical knowledge, cheating at cards, maltreatment of women folk, examination failures, smuggling, and one that I don't even understand, but I will quote it anyway, which is throwing one's wicket away at the crucial point of a test match. I don't know what that means. But he has a long list of sort of social shames that are not physical, not religious, not family, but mostly political in nature or achievement and failure oriented. Right. These aren't hierarchical. They're like different categories. How would you relate to those? Did you see those also in your experiences and in your
Yes, indeed. Yes, because I mean, one of the many shame induced performances is people pretending that they were college graduates when they weren't. My mother was pretending she was a high school graduate in 1912 or something. But to this day, I interviewed people who were ashamed and had lied about it. People who we know on the national scale, we know people lied about their military service, and were shamed publicly when they ran for office, and it was exposed that they had lied about their military service. Who was it? Peter Jennings. Was it Peter Jennings? No, it was Brian, what's his name? It was an anchor, had lied about being in a battle in a plane during a battle, and he hadn't been there. I mean, he had to answer for that. So the shame of lying in the public sphere I think until a certain unmentionable former president, you could be ruined. You could be ruined by shame. I mean, look what happened to the man who was Muskie, who cried. Muskie cried. He was, I think, vice presidential candidate under the 1972 election. Under a guy I liked a lot, but can't remember. Anyway, he cried, and it shamed men that he cried.
Maybe that's a shame where happy is behind us.
Sorry?
I mean, isn't that a kind of shame that we're happy is now behind us?
Yes, clearly. I mean, yes, the people are tearing up left and right now in order to prove they have heart, which is, pretty cynical in many cases. But I can't. I just want to ask you: Is Shame the book in which he is hidden away in a house in Pakistan, and his mother and his servants pass things out, and he doesn't ever see anybody in the world for many, many years? I believe
it sounds right, but I didn't reread the whole book. And as you know, with Rushdie, there's always many, many side plots and subplots. So I didn't reread the whole book, and I don't recall that one. But I do remember that the whole concept of it made a big impression on me. So I'd have to go back and reread it for that particular subplot.
He was a hidden child in his way. Yeah. This child was a hidden child because he was what we now call special, a special child. We have language that indicates we still can't face the truth and destigmatize it. And instead, we have to dress it up linguistically. Anyway, no, I think shame fueled behavior is all around us. But as a Jew, I have a very clear sense that this belongs to us, that we have to own our own shame. We also have to own the bravery of our secret lives. There are some secrets that are survival secrets. I'm watching the current Ken Burns special on the Holocaust, and the number of Jews who were in hiding, the number of Jews who got false papers. I mean, that allowed them to survive. And I am, endlessly proud of people who would give up everything, including their identity, to survive. I had a cousin who was a designated survivor, and he had to, in order to, because Jews were so afraid that everybody would be exterminated and no one would live to tell the story of what happened. So in various villages, shtetls, towns, they named designated survivors who could pass as Aryan, and my mother's cousin was one of them. And he was enlisted by the Nazis to evacuate his village. And one of the things he had to do was take them to, I don't know if it was Auschwitz or wherever it was, and arrange for their being put in the gas chambers. His own family. He had to do this because he had to survive. And when he got here after the war, his hair, he was in his late 20s and his hair was completely white. And after he testified at the World Jewish Congress and Hayas and everybody else to his experiences, he died. So he survived in order to testify, and then he died. And
we know of other Holocaust survivors who were authors who committed suicide after living through it and writing about it.
Right.
Primo Levi, Jerzy Kosinski, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Let me go to a couple of the questions which are coming in. I'm going to give first dibs to our friend Kathleen Paredes, because I think really this is largely her doing that we're doing this together. So Kathleen asks, is this the book you meant to write when you began, or is it a different book in light of what you learned along the way as you wrote?
Great question. Thank you very much, Kathleen, and thank you for masterminding this whole event. Kathleen was a very important early reader of my manuscript. And if you buy the book, you will see that she's the one who wrote the questions for book groups to consider, and they're just great questions. And here's a great question. I started writing a chronological memoir. I was just going to, talk my life, blah, 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 out it would come. And then I found these letters, and I saw a constant mention of shame, of lies, of cover-ups. Shame, lies, cover-ups. And I suddenly had a theme. I had a theme that pursued me, an insistent theme. And once I landed on the theme, I saw the thread that was woven through the fabric of my life. It helped, as you know, when you have an organizing principle for your writing, it just starts, it takes off. And all these chapters fell into place. So it was a different book, completely different book when I started. And then 2 years into it, it became a book about shame and secrecy.
It's interesting to think that you restructured it from a chronological narrative to a thematic narrative.
Yes.
Kind of disturbing, considering I'm working on a book with a chronological narrative, but which is, I heavily debated structuring around themes. So I may have to rethink that.
Yeah.
Now we have lots of great questions now, of course, 10 minutes before the end. So maybe I'll pile up two. One is short and painful, and the other is long and nepotistic because she's a friend of mine. So the short and painful one is, let's see, Nancy Wexler says, do you consider Israel an apartheid state? And if so, is that something you're ashamed of? That's one, think about it. The other one is by Lisa Goldman. I wonder if Letty read the New York Times investigative report about the Hasidic yeshivas colluding with the local government to misappropriate billions of dollars. So don't teach and not teach their pupils basic skills, including English. If yes, do you have thoughts about why the Hasidim are not ashamed, but secular Jews are ashamed on their behalf, which I also, in a completely objective manner towards my friend, think that is a very good question as well.
Oh, it's a great question. I'll start with that question, and then I probably have forgotten the first one.
Yeah, because you repressed it. It's the apartheid question.
Yeah, oh, right, I did. Yeah, I wrote about the A word a long time ago when I first saw Hebron, when I could not believe. This is one of those, I can't believe my eyes. I can't believe Jews are doing this. And I don't know anyone in my friendship circle who are very pro-Israel people who's been to Hebron. So they've never seen this. They've never seen apartheid sidewalks, apartheid roads. They've never seen barbed wire that forces Palestinians to go upstairs in somebody's house and across their roof to get downstairs in the person's house because they're not allowed to walk on Jewish sidewalks. And highways that are world-class highways for settlers and broken dirt roads, dirt passageways for Palestinians. It's a Shanda. It's just a Shanda. And I use the word without fear. I just feel you have to name it because otherwise people don't realize how serious it is, how shocking it is, how un-Jewish it is. Okay, I feel that. And speaking of Jewish, in terms of the story that was in the New York Times about the Hasidim who are not educating their children, i.e. boys. I was in a yeshiva. It wasn't a Hasidic yeshiva, but I went to the yeshiva of Central Queens for a little more than 2 years. And I asked my father to please take me out because I wasn't allowed to study Talmud. The girls were not allowed to study Talmud. And it just seemed, I was not a feminist then. I was 9 or something, years old. But you are ashamed. You're ashamed of your own Judaism when you discover that these rabbis who are so intent on justice and fairness and the halakha cut corners of it when it comes to women and when it comes to their fellow Jews. I take probably at least 2 adult education courses on Judaism a year because I love to interrogate my own tradition. And when I discovered that a lot of the principles that I admire among Jews are principles that the rabbis have determined only apply to Jews. So, you have to be respectful of people, and then it turns out you have to be respectful of Jewish people. I'm not going to wander into the thickets of halakha, but suffice it to say that this was a great shock to me, and I was ashamed to discover that's why you find Jews cheating people on 46th Street in the jewelry district. And there's always an occasional story. How can they be doing this? Well, they don't cheat Jews. That's how they do it. They're not cheating Jews. They're advancing the income that will allow Jews to be successful. I mean, this double standard for moral behavior just is, to me, a Shanda. You know, call me crazy, but it just doesn't feel right, and it doesn't feel Jewish.
I would like to agree with you. It's just that I think that any values that are ascribed to a religious community may be great values if they were applied universally, but they were never intended to be applied universally, which is why I think we have a contradiction between Jewish values and a democracy. I think that's one of the fundamental contradictions. Let me ask another question, because this will bring us back to the US, which is maybe a good place for us to begin to wrap up, and also comes with a very nice introduction again from Heather Booth saying, "You are wonderful," and she means you. I love you, Letty. Has Donald Trump changed our understanding of shame? And what does that do to the role of shame in American life and even Jewish life, presumably in America because of Jared Kushner?
Thank you, Heather. I'm so honored that Heather Booth is on this call. Heather Booth defines activism in the United States. If you don't know her name, Google it, and get active in anything that Heather Booth suggests is effective in the midterms, running up to the elections. Heather, Donald Trump has warped, distorted, twisted, besmirched, I can't be strong enough, the whole concept of shame. He is shameless. He lies, obviously. He postures, he struts like a peacock, and he says things like, I could kill somebody on Fifth Avenue and get away with it. And then he—
As a woman, is that the worst thing you think he said?
No, it was, but I was about to say, and that is predictive of the January 6th, what do you call it? Incitement. You know, I mean, he can get away with anything. He feels he can, and it turns out he can for millions of people. I mean, we had 3 million more votes. That is, Hillary Clinton had 3 million more votes than he did, but still, you know, she lost. So he got away with the most shameless behavior on the stump, lies, falsehoods. I mean, you can't find language to encompass what he's done to dilute truth and make it meaningless. It's the— who was it said, they have their facts, we have our facts. Was that
It was a spokesperson. We have other facts. Spokeswoman. It was a spokeswoman.
Spokeswoman, it was.
Yeah.
It was. Anyway, yes, I don't think you can in any way underestimate what his language and behavior has done to delegitimate truth and legitimate lies and immoral behavior. It's shocking.
Maybe he's a great cautionary tale of what happens when we lose all shame, including the good kind, which you argue for at the end.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the good kind is to be ashamed of him.
That's a good point.
Okay.
Touche. Well, I think we've covered all the questions, shockingly. We haven't really covered all of mine, but I think the ones I have remaining would be just big, long, meandering thoughts. So for the meantime, I want to thank you again, Letty, for both doing this and also for writing the book. Just to remind people, it's called Shanda, a memoir of shame and secrecy. And if you have any shame in your life, you will find a friend in this book. Trust me. So I think everybody should read it, and you'll feel less alone, but you'll also start thinking big about the issue in society.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dahlia.